There are jobs in the Imperium that end with retirement, medals, or quiet burial rites beneath polluted skies. And then there are duties so lethal that even memory refuses to keep them. Not because they are secret, but because no one survives long enough to give them shape. Somewhere between the screaming void and the grinding depths of hive cities, between the flickering glow of the Astronomican and the corpse light of failing lumen strips, humanity feeds itself into roles designed to fail. These are not heroic last stands remembered in regimental hymns. They are assignments issued on cracked data slates, signed in ink and blood, carried out by people who know sometimes from the first breath that survival was never part of the plan. The Imperium calls this necessity. History calls it silence. What follows is not a list of brave sacrifices, but a descent into the duties that erase their holders so completely that even confession becomes impossible. If stories like this matter to you, if you want to understand not just how the Imperium fights, but how it consumes its own, then consider supporting the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. These quiet gestures keep forbidden histories alive, even when the Imperium itself would prefer them forgotten. The order always arrives without ceremony. A data slate pressed into a gloved hand, a destination stamped in Benharic shorthand, a departure time that allows just enough room to stop pretending this is temporary. In the Imperium, permanence is rarely stated aloud. It is implied through omission. No return date. No relief designation. No rotation code attached to the posting. The soldier, the menial, the voidsman is expected to understand what that silence means. They usually do. By the time the transport doors seal and the engines howl into life, most have already begun the quiet internal accounting that marks the beginning of the end. The watchposts exist at the edges of everything humanity claims to control. They cling to the skins of dead stations drifting between shipping lanes, or burrow into the outer strata of hive cities where the air tastes of rust and old fires. Some orbit worlds long stripped of value, their void shields flickering on borrowed power. Others are anchored beside things that should not be studied too closely: warp scars, quarantined manufactorum vaults, sealed cathedral ships whose crews died screaming centuries ago. These places are not meant to be reclaimed. They are meant to be watched until watching itself becomes impossible. At first, the routine feels almost merciful. Lumen strips hum. Auspex arrays cycle through familiar patterns. Vox traffic crackles with distant chatter from places that still matter. The posted watch logs their hours meticulously, because the Imperium taught them that records are a form of survival. Time is divided into shifts, even when there is no one to hand over to. Meals are rationed according to regulations written for installations that still receive supply drops. Discipline holds, because discipline is all that separates duty from panic. Then the gaps appear. The first sign is usually silence. A Vox channel that once carried background noise, static, prayer cants, fragments of administrative traffic, falls empty. The operator runs diagnostics, cleans contacts, recalibrates the antennae. The machine spirit offers no error code. It simply does not answer. Reports are filed anyway, transmitted into a void that no longer listens. The watch continues, because the Imperium teaches that systems fail, not orders. After that comes the ration discrepancy. A crate that should have lasted a month runs dry 2 weeks early. The seals were intact. The inventory was correct. No one can explain it, so the numbers are adjusted and consumption reduced. Hunger arrives gradually, a dull presence rather than an emergency. It sharpens attention, makes the body lighter, easier to move through narrow corridors and maintenance shafts. The watch tells itself this is adaptation. The Imperium values adaptability. The environment begins to change in ways that are harder to quantify. Metal sweats where it never did before. Condensation beads along bulkheads in patterns that look uncomfortably deliberate. On some stations, gravity fluctuates just enough to make the stomach lurch, never enough to trigger alarms. On ground posts, the air grows colder or warmer without seasonal logic, carrying smells that do not belong: ozone, old incense, the copper tang of blood long since dried. These anomalies are logged with care, because logging them is proof that the watcher is still sane. Sleep becomes unreliable. Dreams bleed into waking hours, filled with the same corridors walked during patrols, the same doors checked and rechecked. The mind begins to repeat itself, replaying movements until memory and habit blur. Some watchers start speaking their checklists aloud, just to hear a human voice in the air. Others stop talking entirely, afraid that once the sound leaves their mouth, it will not come back the same. What the Imperium never explains, what it does not need to, is that relief was never scheduled. These watches are not forgotten. They are calculated. Every supply delay, every unanswered transmission, every administrative omission is a quiet confirmation that the duty has reached its intended phase. The watch exists to absorb time, attention, and eventually life, so that something else does not have to. A sealed breach holds because someone is still standing on the wrong side of it. A dead station remains dead because someone remains alive there, for now. There are moments when the truth presses close enough to be felt. A transport silhouette appears briefly on Auspex, then vanishes without approach vector. A distant signal pings once, too clean to be background noise, then never repeats. Hope flickers, sharp and dangerous. Some watchers break then, burning through emergency flares or box codes reserved for catastrophes, flooding the void with please dressed as reports. When nothing answers, hope curdles into something heavier than despair. It becomes understanding. By the time the lumen strips begin to fail, cycling through dim phases that stretch longer each day, the watch no longer counts time. There is only before and after. Before the realization, and after it settles into the bones. The duty does not end. It simply waits for the body to catch up. In the later phase of a watch like this, the station begins to feel less like a place and more like a living argument against your existence. Every corridor you walk is a corridor that was not built for you. Every hatch you seal is a hatch that may never open again. You learn the noises by heart, the thin whistle of air through fatigued seals, the slow knock of thermal expansion, the distant groan of ancient struts under stress. At first those sounds are reassuring, proof that the structure is still holding. Later, they become conversation. The station speaks in its own language, and the longer you stay, the more it seems to expect you to answer. The watch turns inward. When box contact is gone, when supply schedules dissolve into rumors, you begin to treat the installation systems as if they are your only companions. You coax power from failing conduits. You whisper rights of activation over Auspex arrays, not because you fully believe, but because belief is a tool like any other. The machine spirits are old and stubborn, and sometimes they respond better to reverence than force. A single lumen strip that stays lit through the night becomes a blessing. A cogitator that boots without error feels like mercy. But the same systems that keep you alive also keep you trapped. Doors lock and refuse your override. Bulkhead pressure equalization cycles unpredictably, forcing you to wait in cramped chambers while the air hisses and the temperature drops. On some watches, the station initiates quarantine procedures without any new contamination warning, sealing sections of the hab block and cutting them off from power and atmosphere. If you are inside when it happens, you may not get out. If you are outside, you may not want to go in, because you can hear the muffled thumps from the other side, mechanical, rhythmic, patient, as if something is testing the barrier with methodical interest. You start to keep your own rituals. Not the grand ones from chapel sermons, but small compulsions that make the days feel structured. You eat only after a full patrol. You check the same viewport at the same hour, even when there is nothing to see but the smear of distant stars and the pale fog of void dust. You run your fingers over the same Imperial Aquila stamped into a hatch plate as you pass, as if touch could tether you to the larger Imperium that has already moved on without you. This is when deprivation becomes truly personal. Hunger is no longer an inconvenience, it is an atmosphere. It changes the way you think. You begin to imagine the taste of food you cannot name anymore, details from childhood that feel like they belong to another person. Your body cannibalizes itself quietly, stripping strength from muscle to feed the heart and lungs. In the mirror of a reflective panel, your eyes look too large in your face, as if they are trying to take in more light than exists. Some watchers begin to bargain. It might be with the Emperor, framed as prayer, voice hoarse in an empty chapel alcove where the icon is chipped and the candles are dead. It might be with the Omniscia, offered in the form of whispered Benharic fragments learned half-correct from a passing tech priest long ago. Sometimes the bargaining is not spiritual at all. It is logistical. If you can make it to the emergency stores on Deck 9, you can buy another week. If you can restart the auxiliary recycler, you can stretch the water for another month. Survival becomes a series of narrow equations, each one ending in a number that is never large enough. And then, inevitably, something happens that proves you are not alone in your isolation. It might be subtle. Footsteps that do not match your own cadence echoing down an unlit corridor. A smear of moisture on a hatch that you know was dry an hour ago. A maintenance drone, one that should have been inert for decades, trundling through an access tunnel, its optics glowing faintly as it passes you without acknowledgement. You follow it, heart pounding, not because you think it will save you, but because movement is hope's last disguise. When it disappears behind a sealed bulkhead that should not open, you are left staring at the metal, listening to the slow, deliberate click of locks cycling on the other side. Or it might be loud. A sudden impact against the station's outer hull that shakes dust from overhead panels. The auspex lights up with a contact that cannot be identified, too small for a ship, too deliberate to be debris. For a moment, you allow yourself to believe. Rescue. Boarding party. Supply tender. Then the contact drifts along your hull, matching your rotation as if studying you. You send hails. You flash signal lights. You recite the identification litany until your throat burns. The contact does not answer. It simply remains there, and after a time it moves away, slipping back into the dark with a patience that feels almost intelligent. This is the moment most watchers understand what the duty truly is. Not a post meant to be maintained, but a boundary meant to be occupied. You are not guarding the Imperium from the void. You are guarding the void from the Imperium, standing between the wider human domain and whatever waits in the places that are no longer worth reclaiming. Your presence is a plug in a leaking dam, flesh pressed against a crack that does not care how devout you are. The final entries in the watch logs tend to become strange. Some grow too precise, obsessively detailed, as if the watcher believes perfect documentation might summon assistance through sheer bureaucratic force. Others become brief, almost childlike. Heard it again. Lights wrong. Smell of incense where there is no chapel. The handwriting, or the typed script, begins to drift, letters uneven, timestamps inconsistent. Not because the watcher is lazy, but because time itself is losing coherence. And then one day, without warning, the vox returns. A single burst of static. A voice, distorted but human, reciting a code phrase that makes your blood go cold because it is old, so old you recognize it from training archives. The station's cogitators wake in sequence. Lumen strips flare brighter than they have in months. The air feels suddenly warmer, heavier, as if the installation has inhaled. You respond instantly, hands shaking, reciting your own clearance codes through cracked lips. You plead for coordinates, for confirmation, for any proof that relief has finally arrived. The voice answers with only 2 words, spoken with the flat certainty of an automated litany. Maintain watch. And in that moment, you understand the deepest cruelty of these duties. The Imperium did not forget you. It remembered you exactly as long as it needed you to remain where you are. It will remember you again when your silence becomes inconvenient. Until then, you are not a person. You are a function. The corridor lights flicker once, as if punctuating the order, and somewhere beyond the sealed bulkheads, something shifts in the dark, responding not to your hope, but to the sound of the Imperium's attention returning to the place it abandoned. There are forms of death in the Imperium that arrive with violence, shellfire, decompression, the sudden bloom of a reactor breach. And then there are deaths that take their time, deaths that are measured in shifts and quotas and compliance seals. The Imperium's deadliest labor is not assigned to the front lines. It is buried deep in places that never make it into war reports, where the enemy is not an orc or a necron, but exhaustion made systemic and flesh treated as a replaceable component. These duties begin with reassignment notices stamped in red ink, often justified as temporary industrial support. A manufacturum overhaul. A refit cycle aboard a voidship long past its optimal service life. Hazard pay is promised, though few ever see it. What is not mentioned is that the labor parameters were calculated for bodies that do not fatigue, or at least not quickly enough to matter. The Imperium builds as if humans are infinite. Inside these spaces, the air is thick with heat and residue. Promethium fumes cling to the back of the throat, leaving a metallic taste that never fully fades. The floor vibrates constantly, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to burrow into bone. The machines are vast, older than the dynasties that now claim ownership of them, and they do not slow down for human convenience. Conveyor lines move at fixed speeds. Presses descend with ritual regularity. Furnaces burn at temperatures that turn sweat into steam before it can bead on the skin. The laborers learn quickly that pain is not an exception here, it is a baseline. Burns are dressed with chemical sprays that sting worse than the injury. Cuts are sealed with staples that bite into inflamed flesh. There is no time for proper healing, because stoppages are heresy against output. If someone collapses, the line does not stop. A servitor is rolled in to drag the body clear, and the work continues with barely a pause in rhythm. Time loses meaning in these environments. There are no windows, no cycles of light and dark, only the relentless glow of luminous rays filtered through smoke and steam. Shifts bleed into one another, extended by emergency quotas or sudden temporary labor shortages caused by accidents no one discusses openly. The body adapts in small, horrifying ways. Calluses split and reform thicker. Lungs burn less, not because the air improves, but because the nerves dull. Hunger becomes a constant undertone, a low ache that sharpens focus even as it drains strength. What makes this labor truly lethal is not any single hazard, but accumulation. The Imperium tracks productivity with obsessive precision, but it tracks human degradation only when it becomes impossible to ignore. Radiation exposure stays just below lethal thresholds, measured across populations rather than individuals. Chemical runoff is filtered enough to meet minimum standards averaged over years, not days. Every system is tuned to extract the maximum amount of work before collapse, then replace the collapsed unit without disrupting the process. There are moments when the human cost briefly surfaces. A laborer coughs blood onto the assembly line, bright red against rusted metal. Another loses fingers to a misaligned press and is told to report to Medicae after the shift, because the quota is behind. Someone falls asleep standing up, body simply shutting down for seconds at a time, and is beaten awake by an overseer who cannot afford inefficiency. These incidents are recorded, categorized, and absorbed into predictive models that quietly adjust recruitment numbers upward. The most dangerous tasks are often framed as honors. Maintenance inside active reactor housings. Manual clearing of plasma exhaust channels where automated systems have failed. Hull scraping during void transit, bodies tethered by cables while the stars will slowly beneath their boots. These assignments come with purity seals and prayers, sometimes even a blessing from a robed official whose skin has never felt this kind of heat. Volunteers are praised. Non-volunteers are reassigned anyway. It is here that many begin to understand the true nature of imperial labor. You are not expected to survive because survival is inefficient. The Imperium does not need you healthy tomorrow, it needs you functional now. The difference matters. It shapes how the work is structured, how safety margins are defined, how long a human life is considered a useful investment. By the time the body begins to fail in obvious ways, hands shaking uncontrollably, vision blurring at the edges, organs aching with a deep, internal pain, it is often too late to be reassigned. The damage is cumulative, irreversible. Medicae interventions become palliative rather than restorative. Stimulants are issued to keep muscles moving and minds alert, even as they accelerate the very breakdown they are meant to delay. And still, the machines keep running. The true horror is not that people die in these places. It is that they disappear into them. Names become serial numbers. Faces blur together behind respirator masks and grime-streaked visors. When someone finally collapses for the last time, their absence is noted only as a brief dip in output, corrected within hours by another body stepping into the same position, breathing the same poisoned air, feeling the same vibration creep into their bones. Outside the manufactorum walls, life continues. Regiments are supplied. Voidships are fueled. The Imperium points to these achievements as proof of its strength. Few stop to consider the cost measured not in resources, but in lifespans quietly shortened until survival itself becomes statistically irrelevant. There comes a point in these labor pits when the body stops protesting and simply begins to fail in pieces. It is not dramatic. There is no single moment of collapse that feels earned or witnessed. Instead, something small goes wrong and never quite comes back. A hand loses its grip strength and drops a tool one too many times. A knee locks at the wrong moment, sending pain up the spine like a snapped cable. Vision blurs, not fully, just enough that warning sigils take a heartbeat longer to register. In a system built around relentless motion, that heartbeat is all it takes. The Imperium's response to this decline is not cruelty in the simple sense. It is optimization. A laborer who can no longer meet full quotas is reassigned to marginal tasks, scraping residue from exhaust baffles, hauling spent casings, clearing waste channels where chemical runoff pools ankle deep and warm. These jobs are framed as lighter duty, but they are often more lethal. The protections are thinner. The oversight is looser. If something goes wrong, there is no immediate disruption to production, and so no urgency to intervene. In the waste channels, the smell is a living thing. It crawls into the sinuses and clings there, a mix of rot, solvent, and something metallic that coats the tongue. The liquid burns through boots over time, seeping into blister skin and rot nails. People work here bent double, breathing shallowly through rebreathers that clog faster than they can be cleaned. The official guidance says to rotate crews regularly. In practice, rotation requires spare bodies, and spare bodies are always needed elsewhere. On the hulls of voidships, the danger is quieter but no less absolute. Laborers are sent out in tethered teams to scrape micrometeoroid damage and ritual score new purity markings into armor plates while the ship remains in transit. The stars move slowly beneath them, vast and indifferent. One failed tether clasp, one moment of vertigo, and a body drifts away, spinning gently into the dark. The loss is logged as void exposure. The work continues. The ship does not slow. What breaks people fastest is not the pain, but the certainty that it is meaningless. There is no final goal these tasks build toward, no moment where someone says enough has been done. The work exists to sustain systems that will never acknowledge the cost. Even faith, so often a refuge in the Imperium, feels thin here. Prayers are recited mechanically, squeezed between breaths and hammer strikes, their words dulled by repetition. The Emperor becomes less a protector and more a distant concept, invoked out of habit rather than hope. Some begin to sabotage themselves without realizing it. A tool is handled a little too carelessly. Protective gear is left unfastened because it chafes raw skin. Stimulant doses are increased beyond recommended limits, traded among laborers like currency, because exhaustion feels worse than the risk. Heart strain. Blood pressure spikes. People collapse mid-task, bodies convulsing briefly before going still. The official cause is cardiac failure. The unofficial understanding is simpler: the system pushed until something broke, and it did not care what. The few who are pulled from these environments alive carry the damage with them. Lungs scarred until every breath whistles faintly. Joints that grind and lock in cold weather. Skin marked with chemical burns that never fully heal. They are not celebrated survivors. They are reassigned again, often to less visible roles where their reduced capacity will not disrupt key operations. The Imperium does not waste damaged assets. It repurposes them. Those who do not survive leave almost no trace. Their belongings are incinerated to prevent contamination. Their names are struck from active rosters and appended to casualty tallies that are reviewed quarterly, not individually. Families, if they exist, receive notifications couched in honorific language that says nothing about how the death actually occurred. Died in service to the Imperium becomes a phrase so broad it loses all meaning. And yet, the labor continues to attract new bodies. Some arrive through conscription. Others through debt. Others still through the quiet desperation of those who believe that any work is better than starvation in the underhive. They step into the same heat, the same fumes, the same grinding rhythm, carrying the same fragile hope that they will be the exception. The system is designed to accommodate that hope, just long enough to extract value from it. By the time a laborer understands that the duty was never meant to be survived, the realization arrives alongside a deeper, colder truth. This is not punishment. It is infrastructure. The Imperium is built on the assumption that there will always be more bodies than time to care for them, more need than mercy, more work than life. The deadliest labor persists not because it is unavoidable, but because it is efficient. Somewhere far above these manufacturing floors, strategists speak of supply lines and production targets. They speak of sustaining the war effort, of holding back Xenos and heretics alike. They do not speak of the lungs burned out in the process, the spines bent permanently under load, the hearts that give out quietly in the middle of a shift. Those details are beneath notice, absorbed into the humming machinery of survival. And so the Imperium endures, fed by labor that eats the body piece by piece, until there is nothing left to consume. The story does not end here. The duties that break flesh are only the beginning. There are roles where the body survives longer, but the mind does not, and the Imperium is just as willing to spend that resource when the need arises. The Imperium insists that the human mind is resilient. It must be. Everything from Schola Progenium catechisms to Astra Militarum training drills is built around the idea that fear can be mastered, doubt suppressed, and sanity maintained through faith and discipline. And yet, scattered throughout the Imperium are duties that quietly contradict this belief, roles where the mind is exposed to pressures it was never meant to withstand, not in moments of battle, but in prolonged, grinding proximity. These duties are rarely advertised openly. They are framed as support positions, auxiliary assignments, or temporary observational roles. The postings come with dense paperwork and vague explanations, full of technical language designed to obscure the true nature of the work. A Vox relay attendant reassigned to an astropathic chamber maintenance crew. A records clerk transferred to a long-term Auspex monitoring station. A junior engineer tasked with tending sensor arrays positioned too close to warp interference zones. None of these roles require psychic ability. That is precisely why they are so dangerous. The first effect is subtle disorientation. Sound carries strangely in these places, stretching or compressing in ways that make it difficult to judge distance. Light behaves inconsistently, lumen globes dimming or flaring without pattern. Time feels thick, as if each minute resists passing. Workers compensate by double-checking chronometers, syncing their internal rhythms to scheduled alerts. When those alerts begin to desynchronize, panic sets in, not overtly, but as a background hum of unease that never quite fades. Sleep becomes fragmented. Dreams intrude the moment the eyes close, vivid and intrusive, filled with images that feel borrowed rather than imagined. Some dream of standing before vast doors that refuse to open. Others hear voices speaking in languages they do not know but somehow understand. Waking brings no relief. The residue of the dreams clings, coloring perception, making it difficult to tell where thought ends and sensation begins. In astropathic support chambers, the effect is stronger. Even without sanctioned psychic ability, proximity to the machinery that amplifies and focuses warp communication leaves a mark. The air hums with pressure that cannot be measured by instruments. The skull aches as if squeezed gently but relentlessly. Workers report phantom sensations, cold fingers brushing the spine, whispers just beyond the range of hearing, the sense of being watched by something that does not occupy space in the conventional sense. Official doctrine insists these are stress responses. Privately, many know better. The Imperium's response is procedural. Mental health, in the civilian sense, does not exist here. Instead, there are compliance checks and purity screenings. Workers are evaluated for signs of overt corruption or heretical thought, not for suffering. As long as someone continues to perform their tasks and recite the correct litanies, their internal state is irrelevant. This creates a perverse incentive: hide the symptoms, suppress the fear, because acknowledging it only brings scrutiny. Some begin to lose memories at the edges. Names slip away. Faces blur. A task repeated daily for months suddenly feels unfamiliar, as if learned by someone else. Others experience the opposite problem. Memories become too sharp, replaying moments of embarrassment, guilt, or fear with painful clarity. The mind circles these moments obsessively, unable to let them go. Concentration fractures. Simple decisions take effort. Complex ones become paralyzing. The environment reinforces this erosion. Many of these posts are deliberately isolated, both physically and socially. Personnel rotations are infrequent, justified by the need for continuity. Communication with the outside is limited to formal reports that strip emotion from experience. There is no one to confide in safely, no language for what is happening that does not risk accusation. Silence becomes a coping mechanism, even as it deepens the damage. Occasionally, someone breaks openly. They scream at nothing. They claw at their own skin, convinced something is crawling beneath it. They refuse to enter certain chambers, insisting that the walls are breathing or that the machines are listening. When this happens, the response is swift and impersonal. The individual is restrained, sedated, and removed. Officially, they are reassigned for medical evaluation. Unofficially, no one expects to see them again. Those who remain learn to function in a state of partial disintegration. They compartmentalize aggressively, walling off fear and doubt so they can continue. They tell themselves that endurance is virtue, that suffering is proof of loyalty. The Imperium encourages this belief, not through kindness, but through structure. There is always another task, another report to file, another gauge to monitor. Stillness would be dangerous, because in stillness the mind turns inward, and there is too much there to confront. The truly insidious part of these duties is that they rarely kill quickly. The body remains intact, capable of labor, even as the mind frays. This makes the role efficient. A broken mind can still press buttons, record data, recite litanies. It can still stand watch over forces it does not understand, absorbing their influence day after day. The Imperium does not need these people to be well. It needs them present. As weeks become months, and months blur into something harder to name, a question begins to surface beneath the noise of duty. Not spoken aloud, not even fully formed, but persistent. What, exactly, is being protected by this suffering? And why does it feel as if the suffering itself is part of the system, not a flaw? The answer, if there is one, does not arrive yet. It waits, coiled in the deeper layers of the Imperium's unseen labor, where minds are not merely exposed, but actively used. As the duty grinds on, the mind begins to reorganize itself around the threat rather than resist it. This is not resilience in the way the Imperium celebrates it. It is adaptation born of desperation. The psyche learns which thoughts are dangerous and quietly avoids them. Curiosity fades first. Questions feel heavy, risky, as if forming them might draw attention. What remains is a narrow channel of acceptable cognition, just wide enough to perform assigned tasks without triggering panic. In Auspex stations bordering warp interference zones, this adaptation takes on a ritualistic quality. Operators develop superstitions that have no basis in regulation but feel necessary. Certain consoles are touched in a specific order. Certain phrases are never spoken aloud. A particular lumen strip is left unfixed because replacing it once coincided with a surge in anomalous readings. These behaviors are mocked in training manuals, but in practice they spread quickly, because they offer the illusion of control in an environment that denies it. The mind's defenses, however, come at a cost. Emotional range narrows. Joy becomes faint, almost embarrassing, while fear settles into a steady, manageable hum. Relationships, such as they are in these postings, become transactional. Conversations stay shallow, circling weather reports and maintenance schedules, anything that avoids the deeper unease everyone shares. When someone disappears reassigned, removed, or quietly taken away after a breakdown, the absence is acknowledged only indirectly. Asking too many questions feels unsafe. In proximity to astropathic relays, the pressure intensifies. Even without conscious psychic perception, the human brain is not immune to the tides of the immaterium. Workers report headaches that pulse in time with message transmissions, nausea that spikes during periods of heavy traffic, sudden emotional surges with no identifiable cause. Grief arrives unbidden, crushing in its intensity, then fades, leaving behind exhaustion and confusion. The official explanation is empathic bleed-through from astropaths themselves. It is not comforting. Some begin to hear fragments of sound that do not register on recording equipment. A single word repeated over and over, just out of reach of comprehension. A child's laughter echoing in a maintenance tunnel where no child has ever been. These experiences are not shared openly. They are confessed, if at all, in half-whispered conversations during meal breaks, eyes darting to surveillance lenses. The fear is not that the experiences are unreal, but that acknowledging them might make them permanent. The Imperium has protocols for overt warp corruption, but these duties exist in a gray zone. There are no horns sprouting from foreheads, no spontaneous manifestations of demonic presence. Instead, there is erosion. The sense of self thins, stretched across repetitive labor and low-level exposure until it begins to tear. People forget why certain things mattered to them. Personal beliefs soften, not replaced by heresy, but by indifference. In a civilization built on fanaticism, indifference is its own kind of danger. At a certain point, some begin to experience a chilling clarity. The whispers, the dreams, the sensations coalesce into patterns that feel meaningful. Not comforting, but coherent. A maintenance schedule aligns with a surge in interference. A recurring dream coincides with a minor containment breach. Correlation hardens into perceived causation. The mind, desperate for structure, begins to believe it has found a hidden order beneath the chaos. This is where the duty becomes truly perilous. Those who reach this stage often become exemplary workers. They anticipate anomalies. They adjust systems preemptively, sometimes preventing minor disasters. Supervisors notice improved performance and commend them, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the improvement is built on a fragile internal logic no one else can see. These individuals are not raving. They are calm, focused, disturbingly effective. The Imperium rewards results. What it does not see, or chooses not to, is the narrowing of reality that accompanies this effectiveness. The worker's world shrinks to include only the patterns they perceive as significant. Everything else fades. Family, faith, even fear lose their weight. There is only the duty in the sense that it is part of something vast, something watching through the thin veil of machinery and ritual. When the collapse comes, it is often quiet. A worker simply stops responding to external stimuli. They continue their tasks, but no longer react to voices, alarms, or changes in environment. They recite litanies without inflection, eyes unfocused. At this point, they are more tool than person. The Imperium intervenes then, not out of mercy, but because the risk profile has changed. An unresponsive mind near warp-touched systems is an unacceptable variable. Removal is swift. Sedatives. Restraints. A sealed transport. Official records note a medical evacuation. Colleagues are told not to worry, that the individual will be cared for. The workstation is cleaned. The routines continue. Within days, someone else stands in the same place, feeling the same pressure begin to build behind their eyes. The mind-breaking duties persist because they work. They allow the Imperium to maintain contact across impossible distances, to monitor threats it cannot fully understand, to keep systems running that would otherwise fail. The cost is invisible from afar, spread thin across thousands of individuals whose suffering never coalesces into a single, undeniable crisis. But there are rumors, whispered during rare transfers or half-remembered in confessionals, that some of those removed are not treated, but repurposed. That their altered perceptions make them useful elsewhere, closer to the source of the pressure that broke them. These rumors are never confirmed. They do not need to be. The uncertainty alone is enough to keep most silent. By the time a worker begins to suspect that their duty is less about observation and more about controlled exposure, the suspicion itself feels dangerous. Better not to think it. Better to keep the pattern small, the thoughts narrow, the focus sharp. The Imperium survives on such choices, made quietly, one mind at a time. The next layer of duty goes further still. There are roles that do not merely endure or erode, but are erased from record entirely, assignments so dangerous that acknowledging their existence would undermine the faith that keeps the Imperium standing. There are duties in the Imperium that do not appear on any data slate accessible to ordinary eyes. They are not classified in the conventional sense. They are omitted. Their absence is deliberate, a blank space maintained with as much care as any sacred archive. These roles exist in the negative space of imperial bureaucracy, where knowing too much is itself a liability. Assignments to these duties often come disguised as routine transfers. A crew reassigned to temporary containment operations. A custodial unit redirected to terminal maintenance oversight. A small Astra Militarum detachment ordered to garrison a site that does not appear on standard star charts. The language is careful, engineered to sound ordinary. Only when the transport doors seal does the truth begin to emerge, carried in the silence of officers who suddenly refuse to meet anyone's gaze. These are the places the Imperium has decided not to save. Quarantined hive sectors sealed behind adamantine bulkheads, their populations written off as lost but never formally declared dead. Research facilities whose original purpose has been scrubbed from records, leaving only layers of warning sigils and overlapping purity seals. Warships too damaged, too tainted, or too politically inconvenient to return, ordered instead to hold position indefinitely at the edge of known space. The role of those assigned is not to restore or reclaim. It is to contain, to remain present long enough for the rest of the Imperium to forget. Inside these postings, time behaves strangely. Not because of warp exposure, though that is sometimes a factor, but because nothing progresses. There is no campaign to complete, no system to repair fully. Maintenance becomes a performance, a way to justify continued presence rather than effect real change. Patrols trace the same routes day after day. Checkpoints are manned even when no traffic is possible. The illusion of order is preserved because admitting futility would unravel discipline. The most harrowing of these roles are the internal seals. When a hive sector is condemned but cannot be cleansed without unacceptable collateral damage, it is locked from within. Someone must stay behind to monitor pressure differentials, power flows, and structural integrity. Someone must ensure that the seals hold. These are not execution squads. The people left inside are not there to die quickly. They are there to make sure whatever remains does not get out. At first, there is contact. Vox links to the outside, filtered and heavily monitored. Reports are filed on conditions, on sounds from beyond sealed bulkheads, on changes in atmosphere composition that suggest movement or decay. Over time, those channels narrow. Transmission windows shorten. Replies become slower, more formulaic. Eventually, the messages stop being answered at all. Not because the receivers are gone, but because the Imperium has reached the point where continued communication serves no purpose. On void assignments, the pattern is similar. Crews aboard vessels marked for loss are ordered to maintain minimal functionality, power to containment fields, life support to select compartments, auspex monitoring of internal anomalies. The ship drifts or holds a fixed position, its destination removed from navigational databases. Supplies arrive sporadically at first, then not at all. The crew adapts, rationing and reusing, convincing themselves that this is merely an extended delay. The psychological toll of being deliberately forgotten is profound. It differs from isolation in that it is intentional. The Imperium knows where you are. It simply chooses not to look. This knowledge seeps into every action. Orders are followed long past the point of reason because questioning them would require admitting abandonment. Faith becomes brittle, clung to not as comfort, but as proof that suffering still has meaning. Rumors circulate in these places, traded in low voices during shared meals or whispered through bulkheads. That other sealed sites have failed catastrophically. That something inside is learning, adapting, testing boundaries. That the reason no rescue comes is not logistical, but theological, that acknowledging what remains would force the Imperium to confront truths it cannot afford to face. None of these rumors are confirmed. Confirmation would be dangerous. What makes these roles uniquely lethal is not immediate danger, but inevitability. There is no scenario in which they end well. If the seals fail, those inside die first. If the seals hold, those inside remain until starvation, system failure, or madness claims them. The Imperium has accepted both outcomes as preferable to the alternative. Records of these postings, where they exist at all, are deliberately vague. Personnel numbers do not match casualty reports. Timelines blur. Names repeat across centuries, recycled as if individuality itself were inconvenient. This is not incompetence. It is design. History is curated to maintain belief, and belief requires that some truths never be fully articulated. Those who suspect the nature of their duty too early sometimes attempt to force an ending. A deliberate overload. A breach initiated from within. These acts are classified as heresy or cowardice, depending on the political needs of the moment. The real reason they are condemned is simpler: they break the illusion of control. As long as the people inside continue to perform their roles, the Imperium can pretend the situation is stable. And so the watch continues in places that officially do not exist, carried out by people whose service will never be commemorated. Their lives are spent maintaining boundaries no one will thank them for holding, guarding against outcomes no one will openly name. Beyond these forgotten roles lies the final truth, one the Imperium rarely articulates even to itself. That survival on a galactic scale demands sacrifices so complete they cannot be acknowledged without undermining the very faith that makes endurance possible. As months turn into something less measurable, the people assigned to these erased roles begin to sense the shape of the silence around them. It is not the absence of sound or communication, but the absence of consequence. Reports are still filed, logs still maintained, but nothing changes in response. Power fluctuations go unaddressed. Structural stress warnings receive no follow-up. The Imperium's vast administrative machinery, once so oppressive in its attention to detail, has simply stopped reacting. The realization settles slowly and painfully: the duty continues because it no longer matters whether it succeeds. In sealed hive sectors, this understanding changes how people move through space. Corridors feel narrower, not physically, but psychologically. Every sealed door becomes a reminder that there is no retreat. The sounds from beyond the bulkheads, scraping, distant impacts, low reverberations that do not match any known machinery, are no longer reported with urgency. They are noted, timestamped, and accepted. Panic would require an audience, and there is none left. Those stationed aboard condemned voidships experience a similar erosion of meaning. The ship's spirit grows increasingly erratic, cycling systems without command input, rerouting power in ways that make no sense. Tech adepts perform rites that once stabilized these fluctuations, only to find them less effective each time. Some whisper that the machine spirit knows it has been abandoned, that it is reacting to neglect like a wounded animal. Such thoughts are dangerous, bordering on tech heresy, but they persist because they offer an explanation where official doctrine offers none. Isolation deepens until it becomes intimate. People begin speaking to the environment not in prayer, but in conversation. They apologize to bulkheads after impacts. They thank generators that continue to run despite failing components. These behaviors are not signs of madness so much as attempts to restore reciprocity in a universe that has withdrawn it. When the Imperium no longer acknowledges your existence, even machines become preferable listeners. Food shortages, already expected, take on new significance. Rations are no longer divided according to regulation, but according to perceived usefulness. Someone who can repair a failing seal eats more than someone who cannot. This is not cruelty, it is triage stretched across months. Bonds form and fracture under this pressure. Loyalty shifts from abstract ideals to immediate survival. The Emperor remains invoked in litanies, but the words feel increasingly symbolic, a tradition maintained because abandoning it would mean admitting total abandonment. In some postings, contact resumes briefly, just enough to reignite fear. A single encrypted transmission arrives, its origin untraceable, ordering continued compliance and reminding personnel of their sacred duty. No supplies follow. No extraction window is offered. The message exists only to reassert authority, to prevent the dangerous conclusion that the Imperium has relinquished control. It works not because it offers hope, but because it reintroduces the possibility of punishment. The end, when it comes, rarely matches expectation. It is not always a breach or a catastrophic failure. Sometimes systems simply wind down, one by one, until maintaining life becomes impossible. Sometimes the thing being contained makes a final, overwhelming attempt to escape, and the people inside die doing exactly what they were assigned to do, holding the line long enough for no one to notice. In rare cases, a cleansing force arrives centuries later, finding only skeletal remains and logs that end mid-sentence. What never happens is rescue. The Imperium does not commemorate these roles because to do so would require admitting that entire populations were consigned to oblivion by design. It would require acknowledging that survival sometimes depends not on victory, but on forgetting. And forgetting is easier when there are no names, no monuments, no stories passed down to trouble the faithful. These duties persist because they are effective. The boundaries hold. The threats remain contained, at least for a time. The Imperium continues to exist, and existence is the only metric that ultimately matters. Those assigned to these erased roles become part of the structure itself, silent, unacknowledged supports holding up a civilization that will never look down to see them. There is one final category of duty that stands apart from all others. It is not erased, not hidden, but openly sanctified. Its cost is known, even celebrated, and yet its true weight is rarely understood. It is the duty that reveals what all the others have been leading toward. There are duties in the Imperium whose lethality is not hidden, not denied, but ritualized. They are wrapped in scripture and ceremony, spoken of openly in sermons and catechisms, their victims praised even as they are consumed. Where the previous roles relied on omission and silence, these duties rely on reverence. They function not because people are deceived, but because they are taught to accept the cost as sacred. The most visible of these are tied to the Imperium's great sustaining systems, the institutions that keep humanity connected, coordinated, and alive across impossible distances. Here, death is not an accident or a byproduct. It is an input. The Imperium does not merely tolerate the loss of life, it plans around it, schedules it, sanctifies it. The language used is careful and absolute. Sacrifice. Offering. Service beyond death. Words chosen to make annihilation feel purposeful. Those selected for these duties are rarely forced outright. Coercion exists, but it is subtle, layered beneath tradition and expectation. Many are chosen young, before they have learned to imagine alternatives. Others are elevated from broken roles, the laborers whose bodies are already failing, the minds already thinned by proximity to forces they cannot name. The Imperium frames this not as exploitation, but as redemption. A chance to give what remains of oneself meaning. Preparation is meticulous. Bodies are cleansed, not to preserve them, but to mark transition. Prayers are recited that speak not of survival, but of dissolution. The individual is reminded constantly that fear is natural, but doubt is sin. They are told, truthfully, that their contribution matters, that without it, systems will fail, worlds will fall silent, fleets will be lost in the void. What is left unsaid is how many others are already queued to replace them. In the chambers where these duties are carried out, the atmosphere is heavy with incense and heat. Machinery hums with a low, omnipresent resonance that seems to vibrate through the chest rather than the ears. Adepts move with practiced efficiency, their faces serene behind masks or augmetic features. To them, this is routine. To the one being offered, it is the end of everything they have ever been. Pain is part of the process, but it is rarely described in detail afterward. Accounts speak instead of light, of warmth, of communion. These descriptions come from liturgy and second-hand testimony, not from survivors. The physical reality is harsher. The body reacts violently to what is being done to it. Muscles spasm. Breath stutters. Consciousness fractures. The mind scrambles to make sense of sensations that overwhelm its capacity to process. What happens in those final moments is the subject of endless speculation. Official doctrine insists that the individual soul is received by the Emperor, their sacrifice transmuted into protection for all mankind. More cautious voices frame it as mystery, something beyond mortal comprehension. There are whispers, too, exchanged only in private, that suggest the truth is neither comforting nor simple, but whatever is sustained by these deaths does not do so gently. The Imperium tolerates these whispers because they never coalesce into proof. Faith does not require certainty, it requires continuity. As long as the systems function, as long as the Astronomican burns and the void lanes remain passable, questions can be deferred. The dead do not protest. The living are too busy enduring. For those adjacent to these duties, the adepts who prepare the chambers, the custodians who clean what remains, the clerks who record the numbers, the toll is cumulative. They witness the process again and again, each time telling themselves that it is necessary, that without this, everything collapses. Some harden completely, turning inward, reducing the act to procedure. Others break slowly, haunted by the knowledge that sanctity does not lessen suffering, only disguises it. The most unsettling aspect is how normal it becomes. Death by the thousands, by the millions, folded into daily operations like fuel consumption or maintenance cycles. The scale of it dulls moral response. When sacrifice is constant, it stops feeling exceptional. It becomes background noise, a hum beneath the machinery of survival. And yet, without it, the Imperium would fail. This is the truth that sits at the core of every unspoken duty, every erased role, every labor that eats the body and breaks the mind. Humanity endures not because it has found a way to live without cost, but because it has learned how to distribute that cost so widely that no single sacrifice seems decisive. The burden is spread across countless lives until it feels abstract, inevitable, almost natural. In quiet moments rare and dangerous, some allow themselves to wonder what this endurance is actually preserving. Not in terms of territory or power, but in terms of meaning. If survival demands the constant consumption of humanity itself, what exactly remains at the end of the process? The Imperium does not encourage such questions. It does not need to. The structure answers them implicitly every day, with continued existence bought at an unimaginable price. The final truth, hinted at in sermons and buried in forbidden archives, is not that the Imperium is cruel. It is that it has accepted cruelty as the only stable configuration of reality. Everything else, honor, faith, duty, is built around making that acceptance livable. Those who survive long enough to work near these sanctified duties learn a particular kind of arithmetic. Not numbers, but proportions. How many lives for a stable signal? How many screens for a fleet to arrive intact? How many bodies reduced to ash for another day of continuity? The calculations are never written down in full, but they are understood intuitively by everyone involved. When a system falters, the response is not panic but adjustment. More offerings. More fuel of the only kind that truly matters. In ecclesiarchal sermons, this reality is softened through metaphor. Humanity is a candle in the darkness, they say, and candles burn themselves away by nature. To demand otherwise is to misunderstand purpose. The faithful nod, because the metaphor is simple and comforting. What the sermons never dwell on is scale. A single candle is understandable. A galaxy of them, burned continuously, less so. Scale turns sacrifice into industry, and industry into habit. Among the Adeptus Mechanicus, the framing is different but no less absolute. Flesh is weak. Systems endure. Where flesh fails, it may be replaced. Where replacement is inefficient, consumption is preferable. This logic is not malicious. It is elegant, internally consistent, and horrifying precisely because it works. When confronted with the human cost, tech priests respond with data showing outcomes, stable warp routes, functional infrastructure, survivable margins. The numbers justify everything. For the Astra Militarum trooper standing guard outside one of these chambers, the truth is simpler and harder to articulate. They hear the screams, or the chanting, or the sudden silence. They smell burned incense mixed with something organic they try not to identify. They are told this is holy. They believe it, because believing otherwise would mean standing watch over something monstrous without a name to give it meaning. There are those who attempt to refuse when selected, though their stories rarely spread far. Refusal is framed not as self-preservation, but as betrayal of all humanity. The weight of that accusation crushes most resistance before it can form. Those few who persist are reassigned, often to duties only marginally less lethal, their defiance quietly absorbed and neutralized. The Imperium has learned that it does not need to break everyone. It only needs enough compliance to keep the cycle turning. The greatest cruelty of these duties is not the death itself, but the way it erases alternatives. When sacrifice is constant, imagining a future without it feels naive, even dangerous. Entire generations grow up believing this is simply how reality functions, that survival requires suffering, that endurance demands consumption. Any other model feels like heresy, not because it defies doctrine, but because it threatens stability. And yet, cracks appear even here. In whispered doubts between exhausted adepts. In half-forgotten records that hint at earlier configurations, earlier compromises that did not demand quite so much. In rumors passed between voidships that speak of ancient mechanisms operating more efficiently once, before damage, before desperation, before 10,000 years of making do. These ideas are never pursued openly. Hope, in this context, is a liability. The Imperium endures because it cannot imagine stopping. Every layer of its survival depends on the next, all the way down to the unseen duties that no human survives long enough to describe. The watchers who never leave their posts. The laborers consumed by industry. The minds eroded by proximity to the unreal. The erased roles holding back catastrophes that will never be acknowledged. And finally, the sanctified dead, fed into the heart of systems too vast to care. This is not presented as tragedy within the Imperium. It is presented as order. As balance. As the only way things can be. To question it is to invite collapse, or so the doctrine insists. And perhaps that is true. Perhaps after so long, the cost has become inseparable from the structure it sustains. What remains undeniable is this: the Imperium of man is not held together by victory or progress, but by an unbroken chain of duties designed to fail in silence. Humanity survives not because it has conquered the darkness, but because it has learned how to disappear into it, one life at a time, without screaming loudly enough to be heard. The deadliest imperial duties leave no memoirs, no confessions, no first-hand accounts. They do not need to. The Imperium itself is the evidence, vast, enduring, and built upon sacrifices so complete that even memory cannot carry their weight.